Good evening, everyone, and happy fall. Welcome to the League of Women Voters, Lake Michigan Region, State-Specific Programming for Illinois. I'm Mary Beth Nawar, Education Chair for the League of Women Voters, Lake Michigan Region. LMR promotes political responsibility through informed and active participation of citizens in government and acts on selected governmental issues affecting Lake Michigan watershed. For several years, our past president, Krista Grimm, shared her vision for a series of state-specific programs. These programs would focus on topics related to the preservation and protection of Lake Michigan, and would be specific to each of the 4 states surrounding Lake Michigan. In order to bring this vision to fruition, the Education Committee and the Speakers Bureau for LMR sent out a survey to the 4 states. Climate change came out as the most important topic, followed by PFAS, coal ash, and invasive species. Michigan also identified line 5 as a high interest topic. With these survey results in mind, we've prepared a series of programs with 15 minutes on each of these topics. Each program will highlight a different state, and tonight our focus will be on Illinois. I encourage you to join our last program, which will be next Thursday, which will focus on Michigan. And if you have a particular interest in line 5, they will have that additional topic. I hope you enjoy our programming tonight. If you have questions as the presenters go, please put your questions in the chat, either to Rosemary or to myself, and we'll address those at the end. I'd like now to present the president of LMR, Elizabeth Joy Guscott-Mueller. Thank you, Joy.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you to all of the panelists and participants in this program, and to Mary Beth for working together to create this series of state-specific programming for all of you. And we thank you for joining us. We're just delighted to have you here today. And I know that Mary Beth talked about what we're doing this evening, but for those of you who are new to the League, our League of Women Voters Lake Michigan region is a 4-state league plus local leagues that surround the area of Lake Michigan, the Lake Michigan region. And our focus is on preserving and protecting Lake Michigan. And so part of that mission, the way we fulfill it, is to educate folks and then also to engage in advocacy that benefits and preserves and protects Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes writ large. We're especially proud of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years in advocacy as we've joined our coalition partners to work on passage of the bipartisan infrastructure and jobs law that was passed, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. As a result of that work, not only did we preserve the funding that we had previously for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, but it was increased by $1 billion. And this is going to benefit directly the Great Lakes and Lake Michigan specifically. So we're very proud of that work, and we are very happy to have the coalition partners with whom we work to do that. I want to take just a brief minute to give a plug for our annual meeting and conference that is on October 21st and 22nd, coming to you live from Sheboygan, Michigan at the Blue Harbor Resort. I said Michigan? Oh, okay. Wisconsin. Thank you. I was corrected. I misspoke. So Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and it's at the Blue Harbor Resort. And we hope you'll attend in person, but it is also being offered live stream. And we're delighted to announce again that our keynote remarks will be provided by United States Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. She worked very hard on passage of the the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and she will share with us the funds that are being brought to Wisconsin as well as Lake Michigan for purposes that are consistent with the mission and the position that we support. We'll also have speakers from the Environmental Protection Agency to talk about areas of concern and work that's being done in Wisconsin on the Lake Michigan shoreline, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So we do hope you'll join us. The discounted rooms rate is available through tomorrow, so we hope that you will do that and register and reserve your space in your room as soon as possible. So thank you for letting me make that plug, and I'm going to turn it back to Mary Beth, who will begin with introducing the evening's first speaker. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joy. Our first speaker is David Mueller. David is a partner in the law firm Guscott-Mueller Law, LLC, with offices in Lake Forest and Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Mueller has over 30 years of experience in environmental, OSHA, health and safety, and real estate. Mr. Mueller's environmental work has spanned in-house, large law firm, governmental, public interest, and consulting. Mr. Mueller has litigated a wide variety of environmental and safety issues before state and federal courts and administrative bodies throughout the country, including CERCLA, Superfund cost recovery and enforcement actions, toxic tort and asbestos suits, insurance coverage claims for environmental liabilities, OSHA citation proceedings and pollution enforcement, variance, permit appeal, and rulemaking proceedings. He has managed major industrial facility closure, decommissioning, remediation, sale, and redevelopment throughout the world. Mr. Mueller received a BS from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment, where he was a member of the National Forestry Honor Society Chi Sigma Pi. He received his JD from DePaul University College of Law and was a visiting student at the University of Illinois College of Law. He is a member of the Illinois, Wisconsin in-house and federal bars. Thank you, David, for being here tonight. David's going to speak to us about a group of legacy chemicals called PFAS.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and good evening, everyone. Just let me find my PowerPoint. Yep. And share my screen and make it bigger. Great. Can folks see that?
Looks great.
Okay. All right. So what's the problem with PFAS? This is going to be a bit of a primer and an Illinois update. And we're going to learn a little chemistry. We're going to learn a little policy. We're going to learn a little law. So what are PFAS? These are, PFAS stands for a category, sort of a group of families of chemicals called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they're a large group. There are over almost 5,000 plus chemicals, but they all have some things in common. They're fluorinated compounds, and they've been widely used because of their stable, unreactive properties in numerous products, from stain resistance to firefighting foam. Their basic chemistry, it kind of looks like this. You've got generally the dark molecules are carbon, and then you've got the fluorine, which are green, and so it's basically a long. They all have these long chains of carbon, and then the fluorine. Almost all of the connections are fluorinated. So what this does is it gives these special properties that I talked about. Carbon is a very strong chemical bond, so it makes it a very strong and stable molecule. And the fluorine really restricts the amount of other chemicals that you can react, that this chemical will react with. So Okay, so it's a strong bond, and does is it makes it very chemically and thermally stable. It makes it also water soluble and mobile in the groundwater, and it also has surfactant properties, kind of that slippery quality that is very useful. So because of all these things, it's what they call recalcitrant in the environment. Once it's released into the environment, uh, they because it dissolves in water very readily, and it stays around. It doesn't degrade because it has this strong structure. It travels widely, and it's very difficult to treat or remediate. So for all of these reasons, and because these chemicals were not on our regulatory radar screen. They were not regulated previously. They were not even tested for, because you have to do special tests to detect PFAS. And because of their toxicity and the growing concern, they're called an emerging contaminant. And in part, that's because our understanding about them is emerging, as well as our how the legal framework deals with them. So they're chemically complex. There are thousands of PFAS, and as I said, they are. This is a kind of a diagram of a family tree, if you will, of all the different PFAS related compounds. So you see, there's a lot of complexity here, and they the concern has been for recently has been about these older long chain compounds that were manufactured after World War II and kind of the synthetic chemical revolution. And those, although those are no longer made and in commerce, they stick around in the environment, but they've been replaced by shorter chain replacement compounds. And there's not a lot of knowledge about those either, and whether those are in fact safer. So PFAS were useful and widely used. This is an example of PFAS in use. This is, they were widely used in firefighting foam, particularly high temperature firefighting, such as fighting refinery fires or jet fuel fire. And the mill used these extensively because of that stability of the structure. You could throw this foam, this PFAS foam, on top of a 1800 to 2000 degree Fahrenheit fire, and it would smother the fire. It wouldn't break down, and it would be very effective. So what else are they in? Well, they're in, as I said, firefighting foam. They're in paper and packaging, clothing and carpets. So think of Scotchgard, think of the 3M sticky notes, think of waterproofing that you might put on your shoes and boots. Non-stick cookware like Teflon had PFAS in them. Cleaning agents, polishes and waxes, lots of different things, including personal care products, shampoo, conditioners, sunscreen, cosmetics, toothpaste, and floss. So they're kind of because of their widespread use in consumer products, they're pretty ubiquitous in the environment. Because of all these unique properties that they had, they were also used in different industrial and manufacturing processes. So they were very useful in textiles and leathers, metal plating, electroplating, metals, plastics, resins, and molds. They had good mold release property, that things would come apart from a mold. So where do we find PFAS now that the toothpaste is out of the tube? Well, we find them at the chemical manufacturing sites where the PFAS chemicals are actually made. We find them in the product manufacturing sites where they were used. We find them in landfills, landfill gas leachate, wastewater treatment plants, sludges, filters. We find them at military installations and airports, firefighting training locations where these foams were used, and also historic fire areas. We also find them at fuel terminals and petrochemical facilities, and in various waste streams. We find them in surface water and in groundwater and in soils. And we find them in you and me. A California study found PFAS in 9 out of 10 people tested their blood levels. So this is a map of military sites where you have PFAS impact. So it's pretty widespread, but you'll notice a lot in the Midwest. This is a map of PFAS impacted sites. These are communities and community water systems that have been impacted by PFAS. So once again, pretty widespread, but once again, because people haven't been testing for this compound, these compounds until very recently, this map is probably skewed and incomplete. You see, Michigan has a lot of locations, but that is probably skewed data because Michigan has been dealing with the PFAS problem earlier than many other states. So they've been looking for it and finding it, and probably if you look in other areas, you will find it as well. So what's the problem with PFAS? Well, one, there really are no regulations. Weren't any regulations developed. In 2018, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which is part of the federal government, part of the CDC, put out a toxicological profile, and the standards and the health concerns we're seeing at the part per trillion level, which is extremely tiny. Most contaminants that we deal with in the environmental area are in the part per billion or part per million range, but PFAS are toxic in the part per trillion. So it's an order of magnitude smaller. And just to give you an example of what a part per billion is, if you took an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of water and you dropped one eyedropper, one drop from an eyedropper of PFAS into that would be equivalent to a part per billion. So part per trillion is even that small, smaller, and more difficult to sample for. And the other thing is it is highly mobile in the environment, meaning it moves through groundwater, and but it's also highly stable, meaning it doesn't break down. It's sort of an unusual combination that you don't usually find. So it spreads rapidly and it stays around. And all of these qualities make it difficult to remediate, and because it doesn't break down. And you also have these very low cleanup standards in the part per trillion range. So there's a growing public awareness and concern about them. And we really, both on the state and federal level, have been playing catch up in our understanding all aspects of the PFAS problem and issue. I just, ability and persistence, and I think we're going to move on. And this is kind of a visual. This is a depiction of a groundwater plume at the former Oscoda, Michigan Air Force Base. And you can see that these plumes go, the darker you go, the higher concentrations you have. The pink areas are lower concentrations. But you can see these plumes go for miles. That, just by reference, that oblong feature in the middle of the diagram is the runway. So these are really large plumes. And so they, as I said, they move through various ways. They can move through soils, move into groundwater, move into surface water. They can be air deposed as well, and through fallout end up in the ground and in the waters. So the regulatory history is kind of interesting. This type of chemical should have been regulated under the 96 substance control TSCA, but it was the PFAS chemicals were grandfathered in. About 62,000 existing chemicals were grandfathered in under TSCA. So one of our prime tools we didn't really implement. In the early 2000s, the manufacturers of PFAS were very concerned about how widespread it was and how toxic it was. And they went to EPA and negotiated a voluntary ban on the manufacture of this early generation of long chain PFAS. And then they started to develop alternative shorter chain chemicals to replace it. It's viewed as a likely carcinogen. As I say, the toxicological information has been developing. At the federal level, not really much happened. There was a 2018 summit at EPA, but really not much happened until the last election, and Biden's EPA issued a PFAS strategic roadmap and really outlined a systematic way of addressing PFAS. So what's in this new PFAS strategic roadmap? It basically, they want to deal with it in a comprehensive way. They want to consider the life cycle of PFAS and the environment. They want to get upstream of the problem. They want to hold polluters accountable and ensure science-based decision-making, and prioritize protection of disadvantaged communities, taking into account environmental justice concerns. So what are the recent EPA actions? Well, I'm going to start. They increased drinking water monitoring. They've started to bring it into the Clean Water Act and into the cleanup statutes. In June of this year, $1 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law money was allocated to address emerging contaminants in drinking water. That includes PFAS. Also in June, there was the first test order under TSCA for manufacturers, which is the first step in developing uniform national testing and toxicity data. And once again, it helped our get over this learning curve. In June, there were 4 new drinking water health advisory issued that were much lower than the original 70 part per trillion level. And in August of this year, PFAS and PFOA and PFAS were proposed to be added to the list of hazardous substances to bring it under federal Superfund and hazardous waste jurisdiction. So that will help on the cleanup side. So what is the Illinois PFAS experience? In Illinois, the state has primarily been relying on the feds and US EPA PFAS roadmap. There is a statewide investigation of community water supply systems. IEPA has been sampling almost 2,000 community water supplies, and that's an ongoing activity. So we're learning more every day, and that data will be used to help develop standards both at the state and federal level. Groundwater standards are being developed. There's a ongoing Illinois Pollution Control Board rulemaking. And then we have passed a statute effective this year to deal with the Class B firefighting foam. So Illinois is doing a little bit. They haven't really been leading the parade here. So what's the road forward? Well, we need to collect the data. We need to do the science, promulgate the regs, and maximize the value of federalism and the state's roles to date. Some states like Michigan and Wisconsin have been really proceeding in the absence of federal action, and that should be recognized. But we need to establish uniform federal health-based numbers. And then we need to bring PFAS chemicals into the federal cleanup and permitting jurisdiction so we can start cleaning up the historic problem. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Beth.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful, informative presentation. I actually have a question. but we're going to save the questions for the end. But I have a question about some breakthroughs that I saw from Northwestern University. But I want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll address those at the end. Our next speaker is the person to whom we owe this programming, Krista Grimm. She was our past president of LMR, and the state-specific programming were her brainchild. She's been a board member of LMR for 12 years, serving as president for 4 years. She's an urban planner concerned with clean water and ecosystems. She lives in a western suburb of Chicago and is a founder of and serves as commissioner on her village's Sustainability Commission. Krista's here tonight to speak to us about invasive species. Thank you so much, Krista.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and good evening, everyone. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen and get my presentation up. Okay, I'm going to talk about invasive species in Lake Michigan tonight, and it says, as it says, it's focus on Illinois. But I have to point out to start that fish and plants and the other living organisms in the Lake Michigan region don't really recognize the state boundaries. Only humans recognize political boundaries. So when you're talking about invasive species, it's really an ecosystem problem, and you can't segregate the issues on for the individual states. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is the basis for addressing invasive species in the Great Lakes. Both the US and Canada have a legal obligation under this contract to prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic and terrestrial invasive species in the Great Lakes. So let's talk about what invasive species are. And in order to do that, we have to start by talking about what non-native species are. And very simply put, they are species that are not found in the ecosystem. Somewhat contradictorily, when we talk about non-native species, they're actually species that are present that would not normally be found in the ecosystem. They have developed and normally live elsewhere, and they've been introduced to the ecosystem. So you have to have enough presence of a non-native species in order for it to become invasive. So when you have a new species introduced, it has to have enough numbers of the species to be able to reproduce in that new ecosystem and then become stable there or have increasing numbers. And then we talk about them as potentially being invasive. So invasive species are those that harm or have the potential to harm the ecosystem. And there's many different ways that different kinds of species can harm the ecosystem. Oftentimes, it's that they somehow outcompete the local native species. And that could be by eating up all the food or other ways that they take the place of the native species. And then it throws everything, the whole system, off kilter. So in the Great Lakes, we have 188 non-natives that have been identified. And of those, 64 have been deemed invasive. And as you can imagine, there's a great deal of scientific study and reasoning that has to be used in order to determine if a species is harmful or has the potential to harm the ecosystem. Sometimes we have species, non-native species present that we think are not a problem, but over time, I'm talking about decades or even just a few years, can become very serious problems. So in order to prevent a species from becoming invasive, we have to prevent a non-native species from becoming present. Prevention of new non-natives is the cheapest and usually the only way to avoid a new invasive species. So this chart shows the growth of non-native species in the Great Lakes, and it goes back to 1840. The bottom color there on the graph, that gray, is planted or stocked. So our first invasive species in the Great Lakes were things that people put there for a reason. I mean, people perhaps came over from Europe and they had a favorite fish or something that they liked, so they brought it over and put it there on purpose. And you can see that that gray is a significant part of the whole graph. So there's quite a few species that were there, put there on purpose, but then later became, potentially problematic. So starting around 1860, we see a rapid rise in the number of invasive, I'm sorry, I have to be very clear. This is non-native species. So we see a rapid rise in the number of non-native species, and around 1960, the number of non-natives increased even greater. We can see that purple area is ballast water. So it was really an increase in shipping that led to more non-natives entering into the Great Lakes. And that is the largest source of non-native species in the Great Lakes. In the last few years, starting around 2000 and then after 2006 or so, the number of non-native species has leveled off, and that is because we started to regulate ballast water exchanges for the salties, the ships that come from overseas. Okay, then a further distinction between non-native and invasive species is that some non-natives are terrestrial or land-based and some are aquatic. So of the 140 non-native species in Lake Michigan, 97 are aquatic species, more based in Lake Michigan or on the shore. The terrestrial species are more in the watershed, but they can be further away from the lake itself. Of these aquatic non-natives, the largest categories in order, the 5 largest categories are plants, fish, crustaceans, algae, and mollusks. And these 5 categories account for 87% of the non-native species in Lake Michigan. So let's meet some of the non-natives in the Illinois area. The United States Geological Survey keeps track, they have a database of established populations of non-natives in Lake Michigan, not just Lake Michigan, it's for it's for the whole country, but this is what they have in their database in the Illinois region. So one of the most harmful early invasive species was the alewife fish. That's pretty well known, I think, among Illinois residents. And then we have plants like the marsh foxtail. You'll see that when I put these pictures up here, I realized we really have a scale problem. So I put how big each of the species is. So the marsh foxtail is about a 2-foot tall plant that is throughout Chicago area. The other thing that I wanted to demonstrate with these pictures is that they're in all areas of the Illinois shoreline of Lake Michigan. So the alewife they have documented that there's an established population near Illinois Beach State Park in Lake County. So then we have this plant that's throughout Chicago. And these are just examples of where they're located. As I said when I started, these species, really, they don't care if they're in Lake County or Cook County. They're swimming back and forth or spreading across the boundaries. So I'm just trying to demonstrate that, it's really where they've been studied, that's where they find them, because that's where the study was done. We have an invertebrate, the spiny water flea, that was an established population, was found in Evanston. And then we have our goldfish. And, here's the examples, Jackson Park. Again, this is everywhere. But what I wanted to bring up here is that another source of invasive species and non-native species are things like people buying animals for pets, like goldfish, and then releasing them. And then they become established and can be problematic. So how are we doing in our efforts on a national level of dealing with invasives and non-native species? Every year, the US EPA and Canada issues a joint report called the State of the Great Lakes. And in the 2022 report, they rated the rate of new species that are going into the Great Lakes. The number is good because it's not increasing. And it's stable. We don't see that there's either an increase or a decrease in the number. So, as far as how we're doing with new species, that's good. Then they have specifically identified that the number of new species significantly reduced thanks to ballast water regulation and inspections of the transoceanic ships. We've only had 4 new species between 2011 and 2020, and they were all zooplankton. They have identified that zebra and quagga mussels and Phragmites, which is a tall plant, are still spreading in the Great Lakes. And one success story is our control of the sea lamprey population. They judged that we've suppressed the number of lamprey by 90% through the extensive efforts that are being taken to poison the juvenile lamprey on an annual basis. And I just received information today from the International Joint Commission, which is another agency that oversees the Great Lakes, that they just did a study that showed that with warmer waters due to climate change, that the poisoning is not going to be as successful. So right now they're trying to decide how they're going to make adjustments for that. And I believe that they felt that they would be successful in continuing to suppress the population, but they're going to have to make some adjustments. And they also pointed out in the report that the species can spread within and between lakes. In terms of how are we doing with the impact of the existing non-native and invasive species, the 2 governments judged that we are doing poorly. And to be a little bit more specific here, we have this chart from that report. And the second column there is Lake Michigan. I guess it's the third column. In terms of the rate of new aquatic non-indigenous species, they say that we're doing fair and that this is an improvement. For a long time, the biggest issue facing Lake Michigan, according to the US EPA, was judged to be invasive species. So the governments feel that this is an area of improvement. In terms of the sea lamprey, they judge again that it's good and improving. And then in terms of the mussels, for Lake Michigan, they determined that the status is poor and the situation is deteriorating. For the mussels, there's both the zebra and the quagga mussels, but for Lake Michigan specifically, it is the quagga mussels that are a problem. The numbers are increasing. The populations are stable in the near shore, in the mid-depth waters, but they're increasing in the deep waters. And because the mussels clarify the water and allow sunlight to penetrate deeper. It really throws everything else off. It helps plants proliferate where they shouldn't necessarily be. And so that is a big problem for Lake Michigan. And then finally, for the terrestrial invasive species in the chart, you can see that they're reconsidering their methodology and how they're going to make a determination on how we're doing. So they didn't come to any conclusion this year. Okay, so there have been recent efforts in the last couple of years to improve how we're dealing with non-natives and invasive species in the Great Lakes. The first item there, the NOAA has created a new website. It's a database called the Great Lakes Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Information System. A lot of the research and tracking of the different species takes place on a state level or a local level. And so there was like a problem sharing the information between the different jurisdictions. But this is an ecosystem-wide resource so that, you know, someone in Canada might find out that something's going on in Minnesota, and you know, they can compare what's happening and how they're dealing with it and what's been effective. So this is a wonderful way to help share information about dealing with these species. Secondly, Canada has adopted ballast regulations that specifically pertain to the boats that travel from cities within the Great Lakes, and those are called lakers. The new regulations will not go into effect until 2024. And as you can imagine, the shipping industry is opposing these new regulations, but Canada has gone ahead and they're going forward with them. And then in the United States, a law was passed in 2018 called the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. And this is focused on the inland barges, and it required the EPA to come up with new vessel discharge standards. And this again would be for the lakers. And so the EPA would determine the standards based on science, and then the Coast Guard would eventually implement and enforce them. They have not yet been finalized. The standards have not yet been finalized. So this law also created a new program called the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain Invasive Species Program. And it provided $50 million per year for 5 years. When this was going in, advocates had hoped that the Congress would provide separate funding for this program, but instead they have taken money from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to pay for this program. And it's not strictly restoration. So, you know, that's a disappointment, but it is a positive development. And this is studying tools to minimize transfer risks. So hopefully it'll be helpful in the future. In terms of things that can be done to improve approaches going forward is really about coordination. Canada has put in these new ballast regulations. And so it would be really helpful if the United States would have similar regulations so that we're all working. First of all, it's good for industry because they only have one set of rules to comply with. But also, if one country is more lax than the other, then the efforts of the other country is undermined, will not be effective. And then also, we can improve the alignment and coordination of regional efforts. So this graph, if you just want to focus on the darkest blue lines, these are the number of species that states and the Canadian territories are regulating. So it's like the number of species that can't be sold as pets in a given state. On the far right side, you can see Wisconsin has really taken the lead on this and is regulating quite a few different species. Illinois is down, I think I judged it, I think it's the 4th, but it might be the 5th here. Some places are regulating a lot more species than others. And again, if someone can buy, some exotic snake in Illinois, then Wisconsin's efforts to control that snake are not going to be effective. So more coordination, the better. And then I just want to finish by talking about Asian carp, which has taken up so much money and advocacy efforts and is such a concern for people who care about the Great Lakes. You may have heard that Illinois has launched a new marketing plan to rebrand the Asian carp as Kopi. And they have this new campaign called Choose Kopi, Eat Well, and Do Good. So it does not changing the name of the fish or what it's known as popularly does not really change the possible negative effects to Lake Michigan, but it could increase the number of people who are eating this fish, and which would increase the amount of demand for fishing and removing the fish from the Illinois waterways, and so that the population that's downstream from Lake Michigan would be reduced. So in terms of the Illinois impact, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources participates in the Invasive Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, and they have a number of different efforts that are going on to control carp in the Illinois waterways. We're relying quite a bit on this project going on. That's called the Brandon Road Interbasin Project. That's near the Lock and Dam near Joliet, where we already have 2 electric fences to prevent the fish from getting north of it. So right now there's talking about making it much more multimodal. And this illustration is from the Army Corps of Engineers with all the different things that they're going to be putting into place. Right now, the project is in design and pre-construction engineering. A big deterrent to getting this done has been the funding. So this year, the Senate increased the federal cost share of construction to 90% in the annual Water Resources and Development Act. That also passed the House, but the House version doesn't have this level of funding. So it's going to have to go to conference committee before the law can be signed. You may have heard that on August 4th, a 22-pound silver carp was captured 7 miles from Lake Michigan in Lake Calumet. Now, as I said, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources participates in this coordinating committee. So immediately, finding that carp triggered a rapid response monitoring. So the next day, August 5th, intensive monitoring in Lake Calumet in Chicago and the Chicago area waterway system north of the electric fences started. And they did intense monitoring for 2 weeks, pulling fish out. They did not find any carp during that period. Back in July, silver carp eDNA was found in Lake Erie by the state of Pennsylvania, and no one's really sure what that means. So while we're waiting for this big project, it seems like we've been successful so far in preventing Asian carp from reaching the Great Lakes, or at least reaching the Great Lakes in a number that would allow the species from becoming established. But it's going to be quite a while until this project is completed. I'm talking about years. So hopefully it will be successful. Okay, thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Krista. That was wonderful. And thank you again for the idea to host this state-specific programming.
No problem.
Our next topic is coal ash, and returning to discuss that is David Mueller.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Let me just. Okay.
The presentation looks good.
Good. Thanks. Okay. Coal ash and water, how do they mix? This is kind of a nice pictorial of coal ash, and it kind of illustrates several things. Coal-powered electricity generating stations like this one are often located near water because the water is needed for cooling in the electric generation process. And also water is used to manage the coal ash residues. And so then it has to be stored. So what is coal ash? It is the residue or the byproduct of burning coal. And it's also called coal combustion residue, CCR, and you might see that acronym up here. In the environmental area, we love our acronyms. So, but it consists of fly ash, which is sort of the light ash, the bottom ash, which is a heavier ash, boiler slag, which is kind of a glass-like material, and then also flue gas desulfurization material and mercury control waste. And those last two are really, those are what we call air pollution control equipment waste. So we're taking material out of air stream, exhaust stream that's going up the stack. So it's not going into the air, which is a good thing, but it does need to be managed. So this is a kind of a nice schematic that illustrates the whole process of generating coal ash and also how it's managed. So this is the generating station on the left, and you've got fly ash and bottom ash. The bottom ash drops to the bottom of the combustion chamber, and the fly ash, which is flying around in the air as its name would depict, goes into the next, basically this chain or train of treatment equipment, which takes things, a lot of the bad stuff out of the exhaust stream. But then that is sluiced into ash ponds via water, and then that water is sometimes discharged to the surface, sometimes it leaches into groundwater, and ultimately the coal ash ends up in a landfill. And then even though it's in a landfill, you have groundwater impacts, and you also have to manage the landfill leachate, kind of the wet component that begins to leach out of the landfill. So this is what is coal ash actually made of? We've kind of heard where it came from, but over 55% of it is silica or sand. The rest are really metal oxides. There's aluminum oxide, iron oxide, calcium oxide, potassium oxide, and then trace metal oxides. And this is where kind of the problem arises. The environmental issues arise with coal ashes from these trace metals such as arsenic, cadmium, lead, but they're in very, very, very small quantities, less than 0.1% typically. And these kinds of figures, this is kind of an average. These can vary depending on the type of coal you're burning and your combustion process. but that's kind of the big picture. So let's talk about some coal ash facts. It's the second most abundant waste in the United States behind household trash. About 1.5 billion tons of coal ash are stockpiled in the US. So we've got a lot of it already. We've been burning coal for lots of different reasons for about 150 years or more. And so we've got a lot of it. This is a legacy of our coal-based economy. Burning about 4 to 8 tons of coal produces about a ton of coal ash. So we generate a lot of coal ash in the combustion process. Over half, 52% of coal ash is land disposed in ash ponds and landfills, kind of as we saw in the picture, but almost half, about 48%, is reclaimed or recycled for a variety of uses. And we'll go through that. And coal ash is regulated as what's called a Subtitle D waste. That means it's a non-hazardous solid waste. This is from a regulatory categorization. And that too is something that is controversial. So let's talk about that 48% of coal ash that gets recycled in the United States. How is it used? Well, it can be used in making concrete cement products. It actually makes harder concrete than Portland cement. Also using coal ash instead of Portland cement to make cement is actually more energy efficient and sustainable, because making Portland cement requires the use of really high temperature, energy intensive kilns. And so the coal ash has already gone through a high temperature process and makes great cement. It's used in land reclamation. The fly ash, sort of that light component, is very desirable in making wallboard or drywall for construction mills. It actually makes a better quality wallboard. It's the fly ash is purer than gypsum that is mined, and there too you have a potential benefit from an energy and a sustainability standpoint, because you don't have to mine gypsum. You can use this byproduct or waste material. It's used in road construction, road beds, foundations, agriculture, and other kind of various miscellaneous uses. And there's increasing interest in coal ash as a source of what we call rare earth minerals. These are these sort of exotic minerals that are highly desirable for the electronics industry and the computer chip industry and the battery industry. That is, so they may in the future be a source of rare earth metals that don't have to be mined, but they'll be mined in a different way. So what are the environmental impacts? They can be pretty terrible. This is a picture from Tennessee, where a TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, coal ash pond system and landfill kind of collapsed, and it structurally failed, and just tons and tons and tons, billions of tons actually of coal ash went into the river system. So the impacts are groundwater and surface water contamination from both those ponds and the landfills, managing the leachates and seepage into the groundwater. Blowing, dust can create particulate air impacts if it's not properly managed. Catastrophic structural failure of coal ash pond structures. And these happen several times pretty dramatically in the mid-1980s in Kingston, Tennessee. That was the TVA accident, and Eden, North Carolina. Very dramatic, very, very troubling kinds of impacts. There are trace amounts of heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, cadmium, boron, manganese. But part of the problem with coal ash is just the huge volumes that have been created and get created through burning coal. They create a real just material management problem. And then there's the historic disposal in unengineered, unlined landfills and lagoons. Once again, we've been using this for, well over 100 years. So it's been any kind of historic coal station or coal burning unit is going to have a lot of coal ash that probably they built the roads with. It's probably in the foundations. It's probably been used to just fill in voids in the and grade it into the land without much thought. So what is the regulatory history? How have we been managing this or mismanaging coal ash? As I said, historically, it's been treated as a non-hazardous solid waste under RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is the major federal legislation that deals with waste management and hazardous waste management. In response to high-profile catastrophic failures, US EPA finally adopted new regs in 2015, right at the end of the Obama administration, and they were subsequently partially stayed, and then the Trump administration revised them in 2018. And the regs have kind of a part, what I call a part A and part B phase in, because we have all these existing facilities that have to be brought into compliance to these higher standards. So it's kind of a phase in, interim status, and then final closure type scenario. Under the regs, alternative demonstrations for unlined surface impoundments are allowed. You have to make a special demonstration that there are little or no potential for groundwater impacts by leaving these unlined surface impoundments in place. That's controversial with a lot of folks. Also, the rules did a very good thing in that they clarified the beneficial reuse or recycling activities. And so because of that, because there was some ambiguity as to what was really legitimate beneficial reuse for coal ash, it was unclear. But if the regs define what beneficial reuse is, what's legitimate, and then hopefully that will drive an increased beneficial reuse percentage. There also are what are called NPDES or NPDES effluent regulation of discharges to surface water, which is part of this rule package. Basically, that's the regulatory scheme under the Clean Water for discharges to surface waters. And it's interesting, both industry and environmentalists hate the rules. And there's one school of thought that when you're doing a rulemaking, if everybody comes away dissatisfied, maybe you've hit the sweet spot. I'm not sure if we have or not, but it's time will tell. So what's the regulatory controversy? I've kind of alluded to some of the issues. I think the proximity of coal ash storage to surface water, which is necessary for the cooling, has created a lot of concerns, especially in the Great Lakes area and Lake Michigan, where because of the very high Great Lakes water levels that we've been experiencing the last couple of years. So this brings a lot of issues that, were sort of, they weren't, maybe the coal ash wasn't managed perfectly, but now with the high lake levels, all of a sudden we've got some acute risks and potential discharges into the lake. Closure and of operating coal-fired plants and their decommissioning is raising a lot of these issues. We are, in fact, moving out of the coal age, and that's a good thing. And so operating plants that were providing electricity, many of them are closing. And so when a plant closes, you have a number of decommissioning decisions to be made. You have concerned citizens, rightfully so. So this is bringing kind of these issues to a head, I think. Many environmentalists and citizens groups want coal ash to be treated as a hazardous waste. It does not, the EPA has studied the toxicity of coal waste for many decades and has come to the conclusion that it does not meet the definition of hazardous waste, but because of these trace heavy metal constituents, many folks are are very concerned about it. We've had the other thing that creates the controversy are these high profile catastrophic failures such as at the TVA. And then what is the best way? I think we have to ask ourselves as a society and as citizens, what is the best way to maximize beneficial reuse? If we designate this material as a hazardous waste, then more rules apply to it and probably will reduce beneficial reuse. We can mandate beneficial reuse. For example, in many parts of Europe, such as Denmark, they have 100% beneficial reuse of their coal ash because they really have to. They have no land to landfill. In Wisconsin, for example, while the average US recycling rate, as I said, was at 48%, Wisconsin is up about 80%. And they're in the 70s and 80s because they have very stringent landfill closure rules. So it kind of drives, the regulations can help drive the increased beneficial reuse. So let's talk about coal ash in Illinois. Illinois has been doing a pretty good job. In 2021, Illinois passed the Coal Ash Pollution Prevention Act, and they delegated to the Illinois Pollution Control Board, which is the regulatory agency that I actually used to work for when I first got out of law school. They write the regulations for the environmental regulations for the state of Illinois. The Illinois EPA proposes regulations. Illinois Pollution Control Board conducts hearings and passes the regulations. And it's a very comprehensive process. So these regulations created they were issued in 2021, and they really create a comprehensive framework from detection of coal ash, release, and contamination to cleanup. And in fact, the board, I think, was most persuaded by the environmental community rather than industry community in this instance. They also have, and this was required by the statute, enhanced public participation and environmental justice provisions. The law and the regulations require enhanced public participation, and the utilities have to do this and abide by it, and it can be enforced. So right now, where are we? Well, we're in the early implementation phase of these new regulations, and I think they're pretty promising. So permits are being applied for, permits are being issued, some permits are being appealed. Some utilities may seek variances and site-specific rules. So these are all opportunities. These are all proceedings that are either before the Illinois EPA on the permitting side. Permit appeals are heard by the Illinois Pollution Control Board, as are variances and site-specific rules. And so citizens can participate and they can monitor these proceedings to make sure that proper closure and management decisions are being made. So with that, I think we had a choice about how we as a society and as citizens, and really from the League of Women Voters standpoint, how we're going to deal with the legacy of 100, 150 years of coal electricity generation. And I think this is all of our problem, and we all have to be engaged in it. And I think in Illinois, we do have a vehicle for doing that with the new regulations. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that interesting program. It's amazing to learn about the overwhelming quantity of coal ash, but also somewhat encouraging to learn about new ideas for reusing or recycling this. Our last speaker tonight is going to be speaking about climate change. This is Joy Guscott-Mueller, president of LMR. Joy is a managing partner of Guscott-Mueller Law, LLC in Chicago. Her firm's practice includes environmental, real estate, estate planning, and business litigation and transactions. A member of the U.S. District Court, Northern District of Illinois Federal Trial Bar, Joy volunteers on its pro pro bono panel representing indigent clients in employment discrimination and civil rights litigation. Joy serves as president of the League of Women Voters Lake Michigan region, a 4-state, 56-chapter interleague organization with a mission to protect and enhance Lake Michigan and its associated watershed. A member of the League of Women Voters U.S. Climate Interest Group, CIG Steering Committee, Joy also serves as chair of the CIG Water Team. Past league board work includes service as vice president of program and board secretary for her local league and service as an issues specialist for the League of Women Voters Illinois Issues and Advocacy Committee. She also chairs the City of Lake Forest Legal Committee. Past community involvement includes service as a Lake Forest Elementary School board member and in leadership for many other non-for-profit organizations. Joy holds a BA and JD degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master's of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary in Hyde Park. Thank you for speaking tonight, Joy.
Thank you, Mary Beth, for that introduction. And I too am going to share my screen right now. See if that takes hold. Looks like it has. And I'll put it in presentation mode. I can see it, and I hope all of you two can do that.
It looks great.
So great, thank you. So what I'm speaking today about is climate change, and specifically climate change threats to water, and how we can preserve and protect Lake Michigan. And as Mary Beth said, when we did the survey of representatives from each of the 4 states surrounding Lake Michigan, overwhelmingly the response was in favor of doing a segment on climate change. That was the #1 topic that people wanted to hear about. And so that's what we're going to talk about this evening. We're going to talk about climate change threats to water, and the assumption that water is both available and safe to drink here in the Great Lakes may not be true in the future. And indeed, as I chair the Water Committee for LWVUS Climate Interest Group, folks across the country, we meet every month, and they tell stories about safe and available in parts of their states. Utah is suffering, California is suffering, although California is very progressive in both the science and the policy. So they are really engaged in successful mitigation efforts. But you know, across the US that there are growing impacts of climate change on water. And here we see them and have seen them in recent years. Unprecedented high water levels, as well as erosion caused by those levels, in extreme weather and high waves is causing significant erosion in the Great Lakes. You can especially see it in Indiana, where people are losing their bluffs and houses are literally falling into the lake. We also see in different parts of the country rising sea levels, resulting floods and saltwater intrusion in coastal areas. And as I indicated, the growing intensity and frequency of severe weather events such as heat waves and rainstorms and hurricanes all add to the problem. Across the US, you also see that temperatures are continuing to rise. And so this is a graphic that was shared with the attendees of our 2022 Climate Change Forum that featured meteorologist Tom Skilling, Nobel Prize winner Don Wuebbles from University of Illinois, and then Dr. Seth Darling from Argonne National Laboratories. And Tom Skilling shared this graphic, and it shows that 2021 ties with 2018 for the 6th warmest year on record. And the Intergovernmental Climate Change, known as the IPCC, in its report, shared that it estimates that most climate change impacts will be connected to water. Those in the report, it said it included drought, floods, unreliable water supplies, poor water quality, and here you can see the satellite picture that is showing the eutrophication of Lake Erie, and ecosystem devastation. Other examples of climate change vary across the country, so that, and their climate related changes related to rainfall. So they're causing drought and water scarcity in some areas, for instance, on the West Coast, and others. Too much water in some places, not enough water in others. Direct result of extreme weather events from climate change. The persistent drought and lack of water stresses the trees, and the increased temperatures exacerbate wildfires. Too much rainfall in some regions causes flooding, and that's made worse along coastlines by the sea level rise, and it pushes the water table higher. And you can see this in the satellite data graphic also shared with us by Tom in April. This rise in groundwater level impacts septic systems, gas lines, building foundations, and more. And what you're seeing here is a breach caused by groundwater level rise that's disrupting the septic system in this piece of land. And of course, the runoff from fires and flooding can carry pollutants, debris, and contaminants into our waterways, including our drinking water sources. We all know that we are seeing in real time climate change impacts on Lake Michigan. So there's more extreme Lake Michigan water levels. They're higher, even though in 2013 they were at low levels. And those high water levels plus the stronger winds and heavier storms result in erosion, beach loss, damage to shoreline residential, commercial, and industrial areas, as well as risks to communities in Lake Michigan from shoreline sites with toxic materials. And David touched on that when he was speaking about coal ash. I commend you for your reading of the Rising Waters report put out by the Environmental Law and Policy Center, otherwise known as ELPC, another one of our groups that we work with and support and get a great deal of information from. And in Rising Waters, they analyzed examples of impact risks throughout the 4 states in the Lake Michigan region. And those of you who have been with us each week know that we've previously shared examples of impact risks to the other 2 states we've done so far, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And here are the examples that were cited in the report with regard to Illinois. And what's interesting is, you know, we had between 1 and 3 examples in our previous 2 states. Here in Illinois, the report has identified Illinois as shoreline sites as proposing the greatest risks of the 4 Lake Michigan states. In Illinois, we have 63 miles of Lake Michigan shoreline. In addition, the shoreline is densely populated and it is interspersed with industrial areas. And when you combine that with the extreme lake levels and weather events, you're presented with serious challenges. So, as I indicated, the report states that of the Lake Michigan states, Illinois presents the greatest impact risks. And here are the high water and extreme weather events impact risks that they talk about in this report: a nuclear waste site, a coal plant, a dredge dump, Superfund sites, as well as those densely populated communities. So specifically along the shoreline, you have Zion's nuclear power plant, which is a little where, and I live in Lake Forest, and it was closed in 2010, and highly radioactive spent nuclear waste remains, and it's stored in concrete canisters near the shore. However, the site is surrounded by a fragile and eroding dune ecosystem. In Waukegan, you have several industrial shoreline sites, including the old coal plant and coal ash ponds that David talked about, which of course with the high lake levels, the high waves, the extreme weather and agitation really presents a risk of effluent from these coal ash ponds getting into Lake Michigan, which from his last slide, you know we don't want it in there. You also have an aerospace coating facility and 4 Superfund sites in Waukegan. The report also talks about risks to Chicago's north and south side neighborhoods. So if this flooding takes place during an extreme weather event, and we've seen it in the past few years, you have significant flooding along with damage to transportation infrastructure along the shore. Higher water could reach even further and pose to home, businesses, medical facilities, and homes, and more. On the Chicago southeast side, you have 3 industrial sites along the Calumet that already pose pollution risks, and the high water levels could exacerbate these challenges and flood the low-lying communities nearby. So it is definitely something that needs to be addressed, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. What I want to talk about, though, is right now, good news for Illinois with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and efforts to reduce those. So this bill was signed into law in September of 2021. And what's interesting about it, and on our LWV US Climate Interest Group Steering Committee and the renewables, you have people from the West Coast who are very interested in what we did in Illinois, in that we brought environmental activists, laborers, and the regulatory utilities industry together to try to come up with solutions. And it was a long time coming. There was a lot of negotiation and some points in that process where people think it thought it wasn't going to happen, but it did. And CEJA expands investment in clean energy, and it targets a phased transition to renewables and decarbonization by 2050. It also sets a goal of 40% electricity from renewables by 2030 and 50% of electricity generation from renewables by 2040. And then the goal is to eliminate electricity-related carbon emissions by 2045 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And I want to give a shout out to our issues specialists in Illinois, William Kale and Laura Davis, who have really worked hard to keep the state league and all of us members in the state apprised of what has gone on in Springfield with regard to this topic. So how CEJA works, it provides energy credits, and it also provides carbon mitigation credit procurement plans for at-risk nuclear facilities. They've established things like an adjustable block grant program, Illinois Solar for All program, and high voltage direct current transmission improvements. And they've also are working to do a build out of electric transportation infrastructure so you can go and park your electric car. And in addition to the rebates offered by the US, Illinois has its own e-vehicle rebate. And you can see the rebates that they're providing for e-vehicles and e-motorcycles. So we can be proud and happy in Illinois of the work that's being done. It does provide some some hope, because if you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to reduce the impacts of climate change and hopefully reduce extreme weather events, which is really what presents the most threat to Lake Michigan. So in every part of the country, though, as we were reviewing groundwater issue and infrastructure issues, as when we were talking earlier, it's apparent that 20th century strategies for managing water no longer make sense in the face of climate change. And so what are we to do? Well, I'd like to say that if you're not already a member, join the League of Women Voters. This issue is very important to the League. It's been a position for many, many years. And encourage your local league to join or renew its membership to LWV Lake Michigan region. When local league, state league are members, you are a member. And we'd love to have you join us in our efforts to educate and advocate for legislation that preserves and protects Lake Michigan region. And also sign up for the LWV US Climate Change Google group. This is a great group of folks, lots of folks from all over the country who exchange ideas and information on climate change. And there's really fascinating conversations that go on, and you can really learn a lot from it and build some great relationships and get some ideas for programming at your own league or in your own community. And as far as your local community, ask your local legislators and candidates how they plan to use funds received from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. What are they doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? With regard to management, they investing in gray infrastructure or green infrastructure? Are they investing in cement, or are they trying to take a more enlightened approach and provide things like permeable pavers and paving, native plants? Ask them what they're planning to do. And finally, are they evaluating shoreline projects in light of climate change risks? How are they going to meet the challenges of the 21st century in the face of climate change? And then educate your local officials and community members by educational event, 21st century approaches to water conservation or stormwater management. We can help you do that. We have a speakers bureau. You've seen a few of the folks on this event who are on the speakers bureau, and you've gotten a taste of our presentations. We also have other presentations on rain gardens and other aspects of preserving the environment and protecting Lake Michigan. And you can see those on our website. Here you see our watershed model, which you can be trained on, and it circulates to different leagues, community groups. If you think you want to share this in a school or at a library or to a community group or use it for your programming, we'll train you on it, and we'll work to get a copy to you so you can use that. We also have resources on growing native plants, which resulted from a grant that we applied for and received. Finally, advocate for your local officials to pass and enforce building and permitting codes that encourage sustainability and water use, conservation, management appropriate to your local watershed. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening. We are so delighted that you joined us, and I'm going to turn it back to our moderator, Mary Beth Nawar, who is also our secretary and chair of the Education Committee, so she can moderate questions. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you for highlighting some things that each of us can do, and also for highlighting some of the potential speakers through the Speakers Bureau that we have to offer. We do have some questions. If any of you have additional questions, please put them in the chat. Our first question is about PFAS. The question is, are cardboard carryout containers lined with PFAS? And is there anything to stop the use of PFAS?
Well, they used to be. That was one of the applications, kind of that sort of slick, to keep the pizza from soaking through the cardboard. That was one of those great properties that PFAS had. So the long chain PFAS are no longer made. They were, as I said, there was a voluntary ban in the early 2000s. There probably are shorter chain PFAS-like and PFAS replacement chemicals that probably have not been studied under and may or may not be better or worse than the compounds they replaced. But yeah, that was one of the applications. I would say the answer is the long chain ones, the ones that we are studying and regulating now, those have not been manufactured or in commerce since the early 2000s. As I said, though, they do persist in the environment and in frankly our blood levels. The good thing about the ban was that since 2000 they have tracked PFAS blood levels in the population, and it's halved. So the ban was effective, but they are persistent.
Thank you. And I have a question about PFAS as well, which just this past week, I saw a report that Northwestern University may have a breakthrough about ways to break down some PFAS. Have you seen that, or do you know anything more about that?
I haven't. I will tell you, I'm not a chemist, and after I'd given this similar talk, I think up in Michigan a couple of years ago, this chemist came up to me and he said, well, I think we could, like, if you cut off the fluorine and, did this, it would break down to this. And, it sounds like a great idea. And I think we will find some solutions. But I hadn't heard that. I'd be, if you could send that to me, I'm going to look for that. That's certainly good news. And I think, what I've learned in doing over 30 years of environmental remedial work is that we do get better at cleaning up the old problems. We really do. And we're just starting on this one. So I'm confident that we will, find effective remedial measures. What we do today is light years different from what we used to do 30 years ago with in contaminated sites. It's just very, very different. We've gotten better, but this is a new problem.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's nice to think that there's some encouraging news on this, these forever chemicals. Krista, did you have something to add?
Sorry, no, I don't. I saw the report as well from Northwestern. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question. The question is, what do we think of the proposal for a wind farm in Lake Michigan in the southeast of Chicago? Proposed wind farm. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on.
Well, I would just say that, as Joy talked about, we are trying to encourage renewables. So I think we will start to see more and more of these types of proposals. We are seeing, you'll see renewables on a lot of different levels. You'll see under CEJA, you'll see houses with solar panels on the roof, but you'll also start to see, we hope to see, utility scale renewable solar and wind farm kind of applications. So, I mean, it's done extensively in Europe, in the North Sea and in the Baltic. And they're way ahead of us.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Rosemary, did you see any other questions?
No, I didn't see any directed to me. Last time people sent some directly to David and the other speakers. So have either of you received any direct questions?
I saw a question about, is there anything that can be done about the mussels? And I don't, and I assume it was sent just to me then. And so I was going to say there are ways to deal with mussel populations, and they are chemical, physical, or biological. And in Lake Michigan, well, all three are being used. But the scale of the problem in Lake Michigan is such that you can't eradicate the mussels from Lake Michigan. But just to quickly go over examples for the chemical, it turns out that the lampricide that's used to kill the lampreys also kills mussels, but that's only applied once in spring, and it is in very limited areas. So you can't poison the whole lake. It's just not, we're all drinking that water. We don't want it poisoned. Physically, there's different methods. And the one that I'm aware of in Lake Michigan is in Sleeping Bear Dunes. They're actually manually removing the mussels. So they're scraping, and the one problem with the mussels is that when the animals die, they leave the shells behind, and it changes the lake bed, significantly. And so, you can vacuum them out. You can imagine how expensive and just resource intensive this is. But they want to create a better ecosystem there in this one harbor that I'm aware of in the Sleeping Bear Dunes where they're doing this. And then I have an example of the biological as well, and it's kind of an ironic one. There's another invasive species in Lake Michigan, a fish called the round goby, and they love to eat the mussels. So they have actually been, the invasive fish has been instrumental in reducing the amount of zebra mussels that are in Lake Michigan. But in terms of dealing with the increasing mussels in the deep waters of Lake Michigan, I'm not aware that anything has been suggested, and I'm not aware that anything's being done for it.
Thank you, Krista. I want to give thanks to our speakers.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but
Go
we
ahead.
did have a question from Victoria, and she took quite a bit of time to prepare it. So I just we'd have David
Right.
answer it quickly.
I'll paraphrase it. Victoria asks about the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Biosolid Program, which is basically the inert solids from the wastewater treatment process that are used in land spread as a fertilizer. She notes that the solids were contain, while MWRD is in quote unquote compliance with current standards, which I think are weak, that there are levels of PFAS at 27 parts per billion, which is pretty high. And should we be applying biosolids from the district onto land? And that's a great question. I think biosolids have been problematic in the past. Many years ago, when I was first starting out, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which is what it was called, had a product called New Earth, which they gave away and used heavily for land deposition. And because there were quite a few metal plating and industrial companies discharging into the system, they were very high in heavy metals, cadmium, lead, etc. And so that activity was stopped. So I think it's a good question. I don't think we know enough. And before we, basically through land spreading, release more PFAS into the environment, we ought to get a better handle on it. As I said in my presentation, we are behind the curve on this, and we are learning so much, and we do need to perhaps take a pause and certainly look at the issue in more detail and collect the data.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have another direct question, although I don't think it is directed to me. So Ann Treadway has asked, is there a consensus on whether climate change will increase the Great Lakes lake levels, or is it expected to be more volatile, less cyclical than before? Do you guys want to answer that?
Well, I think just from, I'm not an expert, a climate change expert like our folks that appeared in April are, but my understanding is we don't know, there are various cycles for lake levels, and they ebb and flow. And even this year, you can see the lake level, at least on the Michigan side, is much lower. However, what's really significant, I think, is the pattern of them increasing again, combined with the extreme weather. And I think that's, and these extreme weather events and the high waves, that seems to make a difference. I'm going to just defer to Dave briefly to see
Yeah,
if
I
that's
think,
consistent with
yeah,
your
I mean,
understanding.
I think we appear to be in a regime of higher levels, whether they do go up and down, but the intensity of the storm events just create more damage, more risk of all the risks and discharges that Joy had talked about.
And the fluctuations in water temperature also impact the ecosystem significantly, as you indicated. So definitely something to work on. It's a good question.
And at our last annual meeting, we also had a speaker from the Indiana National Lakeshore, and she said one of the most significant things is the rapid change from historic lows to historic highs. So, I think there is a big element of unpredictability there, but all these things together are indications, that things are changing. Other questions? Do we have other questions?
I just had one, I guess, a question and comment for Krista on the quagga mussels. I had read that the whitefish, the Great Lakes whitefish, which is a native species, which were always thought to be vegetarians, have now, many of them have become omnivores, and they like the quagga mussels. And they've also been getting really big. I mean, the whitefish are getting big, which is great for me because I love Great Lakes whitefish, and a bigger piece is better than a smaller piece. But I was just wondering if you had heard or read about that as well.
No, I haven't. I'm not aware of that, but that's great news.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you to Rosemary Heileman for helping to moderate and run the Zoom. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I want to remind everyone that our last state-specific program for Michigan will be next Thursday. If you'd like to join us, we have the same topics covered, geared towards Michigan, but we also have an extra program on line 5. So if that's of interest to you. Also keep in mind, if you've enjoyed these 15-minute presentations, our Speakers Bureau can also provide longer programs for you on these topics and other topics. So thank you again.
And Mary Beth, next week it will be at 6:30 Central Time and 7:30 Eastern Time, so the Michigan people don't have to stay up so late.
That's right. And again, please go to lwvlmr.org to register for our annual meeting and conference. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Mary Beth.
Thank you.
Good night.